Alright, so we're back, of course, talking about some Final Fantasy VII Remake, and we are discussing the remake project and how many games that there may be. Now, here's the thing. This is a topic that we've talked about several times over the last couple of years at this point. That being said, as with most of our discussion videos, I can't seem to find a dedicated video about it on my channel. I probably just talk about this off and on throughout many other videos, but just looking at my channel, like how many games, how many episodes, how many parts, there's just not a video for that. And also, I wouldn't come to you guys with this without a reason. There's a recent kind of rumor going around that somebody had some inside information about there being only 3 parts. So we have this tweet from Genki Japan from a few days ago that says, "I've heard word on the street that Final Fantasy VII Remake will be 3 parts in total. I heard this over a year ago, so I don't know what the situation is now." And then they hit a fucking XD face in 2022. Now, before we continue with the video, I want to preface this by saying that I don't know this account. I don't know this person. I don't know anything about them. I don't know if they're a reputable source or if they have reputable sources, if they've talked about or discussed things in the past, like leaks and things like that for games that have been accurate. I have no idea. Maybe you guys do and can let me know in the comments. I know of some of the insiders. We've talked about shit on like Reset Era and stuff like that, some of the accounts over there. I don't know this person. Here's what I will say, though. It's been a few days, and nobody's really talking about this outside of Twitter. Like, it's being shared over there, obviously, because that's where it came from. But, like, there's not any, like, the clickbait, shitty websites like Screen Rant and all of them who will not hesitate to make any sort of article they can about Remake. Also, the Remake subreddit that I frequent, one that I show in pretty much every single video when I talk about Reddit, nobody's talking about this over there either, which is weird because usually that subreddit's on top of everything. They have, like, 100,000 plus members or whatever the case. And anytime there's any sort of just the tiniest crumb of information, somebody's posting about it, and nobody's even shared this tweet over there over the last few days, which I found to be kind of weird too. As somebody who is constantly trying to look up information and news and things to talk about when it comes to Remake, I know what to expect to see on different platforms based on what the community is discussing, and the fact that nobody's picked this up is kind of strange, and I've definitely seen tweets with way less traction than this one get picked up by news sources and Reddit and things. Now, I don't know why that would be, and I don't even know if it matters, but I figured I'd mention it. The other things that stick out to me from this is that they say that they had, the word on the street, the information that they have, was the remake was going to be 3 parts, but that's something they got over a year ago. That's info they got more than a year ago at this point. So why are they just not talking about it? That's just stuck out as weird as hell to me. But even beyond just that, somebody's saying that they have information or news that the game's going to be 3 parts. That's not info. That's not news. We've been talking about that since 2015. We've been talking about that for 7 years now. That Remake was potentially going to be 3 parts. More than likely 3 parts. But even just beyond fan speculation and the community discussing it, we had Katase over 2 years ago more or less confirmed that the game would probably be 3 parts. This quote comes directly out of the Ultimania for Remake, and it says, "We have a general idea of how the story will play out, but we haven't decided exactly how many parts, nor can we confirm anything. Katase is reported as saying, there's speculation that it will be 3 parts, but we're just doing things one step at a time." Now, initially when I covered that quote over 2 years ago in a video, I was a little unsure of what Katase meant by that, as in I wasn't sure if he meant internally they think that there might be 3 parts, or if he meant like the speculation out there amongst the community and the fan base. But I think looking back at it over all this time later, especially since it's a quote coming out of the Ultimania, that he means internally. As in, the developers have an idea of what they want to do with the game and the story, but they just don't know how many parts there's going to be. But internally, as of back then with that quote, they were thinking that there would maybe be 3 games. That Katase quote came out, over 2 years ago alongside the Nomura quote that people have referenced a lot over the last couple of years, where Nomura talked about if they make the games smaller, they can put them out faster. If they make the games bigger, it's going to take longer. Where we stand at these days on how many parts and how big the game's going to be, obviously I'm not entirely sure. The fan base is super rabid. So don't be surprised if when we get the next game, like, for one, if they make the game smaller to get them out faster, there's going to be a lot of parts. Like, we're talking about 3 parts all the time, but if they're trying to appease the fan base that is just foaming at the mouth for another game. Like, people have been, like, talking about part 2, like, a month or 2 after the first game release. Like, that's how rabid the fan base is for this. And I could see them wanting to meet that demand by making the game smaller and putting it out quicker. And if that is the case, then there could be quite a few games, maybe. And again, if these end up being like smaller games and there's a bunch of parts to them, there's nobody to blame but the community, because the community demand is just so motherfucking high. Again, it's only been 2 years, and people are already expecting part 2. And I'm not saying they can't deliver a sequel in that amount of time, because they did that with like the 13 trilogy. Like, those games came out roughly about 2 years apart, so it is entirely possible. And I think like Final Fantasy X-2 came out within a year or 2 after the first one. So they've done that before, and with they already having the assets from Remake Part 1, they can make certain aspects of Part 2 faster. So it is feasible and possible, but if these are smaller games, if there's less content in Part 1 within Part 2, and it ends a lot sooner than we were expecting, again, nobody to blame but the community. Like, because people just don't want to give them time to develop the game. Now, some people out there seem to think that there's going to be a shit ton of games, which, again, I guess depending on how small the sequels are, it's possible. But I think a realistic answer for how many games is somewhere like 3 or 4 games. 4, I think, is possible, just kind of depending, with all the additional stuff and how much they might expand locations. It is possible that they could squeeze out a 4th game. I don't think anything beyond that. Some people speculate 5, 6, 7, 8 games and shit like that. But that's mostly based on people thinking that they're going to expand like every single location and aspect of the FF7 story to the degree that they expanded Midgar with the first remake game, but that's obviously not going to be the case. Now, they're going to make locations more realistic and bigger and things like that, actual towns and shit like that. What people seem to forget a lot of times is that the Midgar segment of the original Final Fantasy VII does account for quite a bit of the game. Now, it's not half or a third, but the Midgar segment can take anywhere from like 5 to 7 hours, just kind of depending on if you know what you're doing and how much you just run around exploring and things like that. But the full FF7 story only takes like 30-something hours to complete if you're just playing the story. So whenever the Midgar segment's accounting for 5 to 7 hours of a 30-hour game, that's quite a bit, man. And the thing is, when it comes to the original Final Fantasy VII, once we get outside of Midgar, there's not really any story, or at least that much story, until Junon. Now, you get the Calm flashback in Calm, but in the town of Calm, not really any story. Chocobo Farm, not really any story. Mithril Mine, we run into the Turks, but not much story there. Fort Condor, not really any story there. And then we get to Junon. And weirdly enough, that's kind of the narrative for a lot of FF7, even something like Nibelheim, which is this iconic location within the compilation for Final Fantasy VII. With the original FF7, you can just walk through it. There's actually no story there. You can have a run-in with Sephiroth in the basement of the Shinra Manor. You can get Vincent, you can talk to the townspeople. But in terms of the actual story of the game, there's not much there. There's almost nothing, to be honest. With the original Final Fantasy VII, you can walk into the town of Nibelheim, have the conversation with the party members, and then you can walk straight to Mount Nibel. You don't have to stop at any location if you don't want to. And that's going to be different when it comes to Remake. They're going to make us have some sort of story at each location. But the point of bringing this up is we don't know if each location is going to be its own dedicated chapter, because it could turn all these locations that are practically nothing with the original FF7 into either their own dedicated chapters or blend a couple locations together for one chapter. For example, Part 2 is going to open up with probably the Calm flashback, and that may or may not be its own chapter, we do not know, but once we get outside of the Calm flashback, from Calm to the Chocobo Farm to probably the swamp outside of Mithril Mine, that could, all 3 of those locations could be one chapter, because they don't need that much narrative. That could there's no reason to make like the Chocobo Farm its own chapter. Like, what would we even do there? Like, I definitely want story and narrative when it comes to the town of Calm, because of the original game, we just do the Calm flashback and then we leave, but I don't want to spend necessarily an entire chapter inside of Calm. I want to get out and explore the world. So the realistic answer for how many games there's going to be, it really comes down to how much they put into Part 2. Like, Part 2 is going to be the definitive answer in a lot of ways for how many parts there's going to be, because it just depends on how much they want to add into the game. Like, how many locations are going to be their own new stories and dedicated chapters? How many locations are we going to, quote-unquote, kind of bypass, just kind of walk through? Maybe we talk to some characters. Maybe we do a quest or two there, but it's not a full hour, 2-hour chapter. It just kind of comes down to all that, because we just don't know. Because based on the original game, there's not a lot of story for a lot of locations. A lot of locations you just kind of pass through. And maybe they're going to expand them to some degree, but maybe still with the remake story, we're more or less just going to kind of pass through those locations while we're trying to chase down Sephiroth. But hopping back to the Katase quote here towards the end of the video. Back then, Katase was saying that they didn't know for sure. They had an idea what to do with the remake story, but they didn't know how many parts it was going to be, but speculation of 3 parts. And if we use that as a baseline, as in there's only going to be 2 more games, there would be quite a bit of story for Part 2. Because there's still quite a bit of story to tell, because we have the rest of Disc 1 with the original Final Fantasy VII, all of Disc 2, and what little bit of stuff there is on Disc 3. Disc 3, there's not a lot, right? There's a little bit of story, and it's mostly the final dungeon. That's kind of what Disc 3 is with the original FF7. There's still a lot of story to tell, but if back then they were only speculating 2 more games beyond the first one, maybe we do go beyond Nibelheim. I've always said Nibelheim's a good stopping point, but if they were thinking that they could only do 2 more games, or they're only going to try to do 2 more games, they might squeeze a shit ton of story into the second game, man. I don't know. To be clear here, I've never been against the idea of Part 2 going beyond Nibelheim. I'm just looking at it in somewhat realistic perspectives because of them expanding locations and probably adding story and narrative to locations that I wasn't entirely sure how much they could squeeze into the second game, but I've never really thought about them maybe merging a lot of locations into like one chapter. That's a possibility, like we just discussed, Calm, Chocobo Farm, Mithril Mine Swamp thing, whatever you want to call it. Like, if they do that around the map a couple of times where they blend a couple locations into one chapter, we could get kind of far into the FF7 story, which I'd be perfectly fine with. It all remains to be seen, my dudes, and hopefully we get some answers within the next couple of weeks. We know next month, June, sometime in June, we're going to be getting some FF7 25th anniversary news, and hopefully some of that pertains to the remake project. But my dudes, that is going to be pretty much the video, so of course I want to pass it off to you guys. Now, this is a topic we have been discussing for the last 2 to 3 years, like a lot, right? We've talked about it off and on, but again, never done a really dedicated video for it. What are your thoughts as of right now that we're on the eve of potentially some remake news next month? how many games do you think there are going to be, and how far into the story do you think we're going to get with part 2? This is one of the longer videos I made in a while, but it's definitely something I want to discuss and talk about, especially with how excited we are for the potential of some information next month. Anyways, my dudes, that's the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, give a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't able to today. More Final Fantasy 7 Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, @YT. I'm a Discord. Links to the networks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more. And nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine or leave it like Cobain.